My name is Margaret Callaway, and I am 65. I adjusted my scarf as I stepped into the sunlit Queen Anne Cafe, the early morning light bouncing off the polished wood floors. At this age, I had learned that appearances mattered less than the quiet strength behind them, and today I carried that strength like armor. My gray-streaked hair was neatly pinned back. My hands rested calmly on the table before me, and my eyes swept over the familiar faces of my family, each lost in their own preoccupations. Jason, my eldest, at 38, sat across from me, phone in hand, already frowning as he scrolled through emails. My younger daughter, Leia, tapped impatiently on her tablet, oblivious to the tension simmering just beneath the surface. I sipped my coffee, feeling the rich warmth spread through my chest, a small comfort before the storm. Then Jason's voice cut sharply through the quiet chatter.
"We're not your bank anymore,"
he snapped, eyes narrowing, smugness dripping from every word. The sentence landed like a hammer against a fragile vase, and I let it sit in the air a moment, giving it the weight it deserved. My lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, though my pulse quickened slightly around us. The cafe seemed to pause, the background hum of conversation fading as his words settled. I studied him calmly, his sense of entitlement, the belief that he could command the world without consequence. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had no idea that everything he and Leia had depended on for years was quietly under my control. I set my cup down and straightened my posture, letting the silence stretch a beat longer. Then I reached subtly for my phone, the familiar glow of the trust manager's notification already waiting. As I read the message, I felt a thrill of quiet satisfaction. The game I realized was about to change entirely. I sat back in the leather armchair of my quiet Seattle study, letting the early afternoon sun spill across the bookshelves lined with family photos and ledgers. At 65, I had learned the value of silence and observation, and the ability to let others underestimate you. My hands rested lightly on the armrests, but beneath that calm exterior lay decades of careful calculation, a lifetime of keeping the family's finances balanced while letting them believe they were steering the ship, as Jason's words from the cafe echoed in my mind. "We're not your bank anymore." I allowed myself a small, private smile. They had no idea. No one had ever asked how I had quietly managed the trust since their father's passing. Each allowance, each property expense, each investment decision had passed through my hands with precision. Memories flickered like film strips. Late nights poring over statements at our old townhouse in Magnolia, phone calls with attorneys and accountants that my family assumed were mundane, and the meticulous notes I kept outlining distributions and contingencies. My work had always been invisible, hidden beneath the illusion of modesty and restraint. I remembered explaining to Jason years ago that his college tuition had been covered by a combination of trust distributions and smart investments. He had nodded and gone about his life, never considering the careful orchestration behind it. I adjusted the framed photograph of my late husband on the mantel. His trust in me had been absolute. He had known I would ensure the family's security while also instilling discipline in subtle ways. That same foresight now gave me a sense of quiet power as I considered the text waiting on my phone. Approvals pending. With a slow exhale, I tapped the screen and brought up the monthly allowance requests. The familiar list of names and amounts gleamed back at me, a testament to years of invisible authority. My smile widened, though no one could see it. They thought they were confronting me. The truth was, the res had always been in my hands. I stepped into the sleek downtown apartment, the city skyline glittering through floor-to-ceiling windows, and let my eyes sweep over the room. At 65, I had learned to read people as easily as a ledger. And today, I was taking measure of my children's expectations. Jason lounged on the leather sofa, arms crossed, while Leia paced impatiently, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. Even my youngest, Peter, hovered near the kitchen counter, nervously twisting his wedding band. "I just don't understand why this has to be so complicated," Jason said, voice tight with frustration. "We've been supported for years, school, rent, vacations. We earned it." "Mom." His eyes flicked to Leia and Peter, seeking their agreement. I leaned casually against the kitchen island, letting him exhaust himself. "Earned it," I repeated softly, letting the word hang in the air. "You think dependence on a family trust counts as achievement?" Leia's pace slowed. "It's not like we were asking for handouts without reason. We contributed in our own way. Business partnerships, advice, ideas." Her tone was sharp, defensive. I let their words roll over me, noting the assumptions, the sense of entitlement, and the glaring lack of preparation for real-world responsibility. They argued as though comfort and security were their birthright, blind to the work, planning, and sacrifices I had made to provide it. Their version of contribution was a fraction of the oversight, strategy, and patience I had invested for decades. I sipped my coffee, maintaining a calm exterior, and allowed the room's tension to build. Every protest, every self-justification highlighted the fragility of their perceived control. As their voices rose and fell, I already knew the quiet power I held, unseen, unquestioned, and absolute. The conversation would pass, but the real reckoning was waiting elsewhere. Just a tap away on my phone, I had just returned to my apartment. The Seattle skyline glowing through the window as twilight crept over the sound. At 65, I had learned to move quietly, to let appearances suggest calm, while my mind weighed every detail. My coat hung neatly on the rack, and I set my bag down with deliberate care, the familiar rhythm of the evening grounding me. My phone buzzed against the polished oakside table, a soft vibration that made me pause. A message from Whitman Trust Management appeared on the screen. "Monthly allowance approvals pending. Jason, Leia, Peter, $15,000 each." I let the notification sit there glowing while I sank into the armchair by the window. The numbers, simple on the surface, carried weight far beyond their figures. Each dollar represented years of dependence, of entitlement, of assumptions that the family's comfort was theirs to command. I traced the light on the screen with a finger, feeling the familiar surge of quiet authority. No one in my family suspected how carefully I had monitored every expense, every distribution, every contingency that allowed their lives of ease to continue without interruption. I sipped my tea, savoring its warmth, and let my thoughts drift through the years of oversight. The subtle checks, the invisible approvals, the discreet reminders that had kept the family afloat, all unnoticed, all taken for granted. And now, with one decision, everything could shift. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of traffic below. I rested the phone in my palm. Considering the impact, the lessons, and the consequences, my calm exterior masked a mind racing with possibilities, each more precise, more effective than the last. Finally, I tapped the screen to open the approval list again. The familiar glow reflected in my eyes. The game had changed, though they had no idea yet. I sat in the quiet of my Seattle apartment, the last rays of sun slipping behind the distant Olympic mountains, and let the glow of my phone's screen illuminate my face. At 65, I had learned that power often hid behind patience, behind the ability to wait until the perfect moment to act. Tonight, that moment was mine. The notification from Whitman Trust Management blinked patiently. Jason, Leia, Peter, $15,000 monthly allowances pending approval. My fingers hovered over the screen. I felt the familiar, steady pulse of control that came from years of silent stewardship. I had watched them assume for decades that their comfort depended solely on their charm, their effort, their entitlement. They had never realized that every dollar, every distribution had passed through my hands first. I closed my eyes briefly, recalling Jason's smug smile at brunch, Leia's impatient tapping of her heels, Peter's hesitant interjections. All of them believed they held the power that their demands could shape reality. The delicious irony was not lost on me. The very lives they lived so confidently depended entirely on my discretion. One deep breath, and I opened the approval interface again. I reviewed each name, each figure, ensuring the amounts matched their usual expectations. I imagined the faces they would make when they discovered the truth, the shock, the disbelief, the scrambling for justification. I savored the anticipation, quietly knowing they could not see what I saw, the control precise and absolute. Then, with deliberate calm, I typed "denied" for each allowance request. The screen blinked back, confirming my decision, and I set the phone aside as though nothing had happened. In this small, silent act, I held the power of a storm restrained. My family continued their lives, unaware that their foundations had shifted beneath them, that every expectation they had relied upon had been quietly recalibrated by me. I leaned back, hands folded across my lap, and let the weight of the moment settle. Outside, the city lights began to flicker on each one, a reminder of the world moving forward, unaware, unprepared, and yet utterly dependent on my discretion. The calm before the storm stretched around me, absolute and unbroken, as I prepared to watch the consequences unfold. By the next morning, the city hummed with the usual bustle. But inside the Thompson family's world, the rhythm had broken. I sat in my Queen Anne living room, sunlight filtering through the bay windows, observing the storm I had set into motion with quiet detachment. At 65, I had cultivated patience and perspective, and now I watched the results of careful, deliberate action unfold. The first frantic call came from Jason. His voice, sharp and incredulous, vibrated through the phone speaker. "Mom, what did you do?" "My cards are declined. How is this possible?" I sipped my tea, letting the panic thread through his words, tasting the irony without a flicker of shame. Next, Leia's voice joined the chorus. She sounded near tears, pacing the polished hardwood of her apartment, rattling off bills, maintenance fees and staff payrolls, the housekeepers, Margaret, the gardeners, the auto payments for our vacations. "Everything is frozen. You can't just—" She stopped, realizing there was nothing she could do. Peter called last, fumbling with his wedding planning expenses. "Mom, utilities, catering deposits. They're bouncing." "What's happening?" I allowed a faint, private smile. Their disbelief was a balm, a reminder of how little they had ever understood about the structure supporting their lives. From my perspective, the world outside continued its steady, indifferent motion. Streetcars rattled along the rails. Fairy horns echoed across Puet Sound, and office windows glinted with the sun. Yet within the walls of each apartment, panic rippled through my family's routines, unraveling the comfortable lives they had taken for granted. I leaned back, folding my hands over my lap, and allowed the full extent of the consequences to settle over them, invisible from where I sat. Every halted payment, every declined card, every shocked exclamation reinforced the lesson they had ignored for decades. Security without responsibility is fragile, and reliance without accountability can collapse in an instant. By mid-morning, the calls had slowed to breathless updates and whispered consultations. I let the silence stretch, knowing they would soon piece together the reality their safety net had vanished, and I had orchestrated it with care, precision, and the quiet satisfaction of authority long unseen as I set down my cup. The city skyline glimmered beyond the windows, a reminder that life moved on regardless. The family's reckoning was just beginning, and I was ready to observe. Patient and in control, I waited in the quiet of my office, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the bookshelves lined with ledgers, trust documents, and family photos. At 65, I had long understood the art of subtle control, the power of observation, discretion, and timing. Today, all of it would converge in a revelation that my family could no longer ignore. The first knock on the door was Jason, followed quickly by Leah and Peter. Their faces were pale eyes wide with disbelief as they shuffled into the room. Phones clutched tightly, papers scattered across their laps. The usual arrogance that marked their every interaction had been replaced with raw uncertainty. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in front of me. "I think it's time you understand exactly how things have been managed," I said, calmly, letting the weight of my words settle before continuing. Their collective breath caught, a quiet chorus of anticipation and fear. One by one, I laid out the facts. The Thompson Family Trust, established by your father, valued at $23.7 million, has been under my oversight for years. Every monthly allowance, every property expense, every distribution decision has passed through my hands. I produced the official documentation, letting the crisp pages slide across the desk like evidence in a courtroom. Jason's jaw tightened. "You what? All this time?" His voice cracked with disbelief. Leia's hand trembled as she clutched her tablet. Peter simply stared, trying to process the implications. The months of assumed independence now revealed as complete reliance. I let them absorb the truth, allowing the tension to stretch exquisite and undeniable their assumptions about my finances, my modest lifestyle, the way I had appeared to just get by, all shattered in an instant. I had quietly controlled their lives, maintained their comfort, and prepared for every contingency without so much as a complaint or a boast. They looked to one another, searching for answers, explanations, or someone to blame, but found none. I held their gaze with the calm authority of someone who had earned it through decades of diligence, foresight, and patience. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of traffic outside. Their shock was palpable. And in that suspended moment, the quietest person in the family held the undeniable power. The next morning, the city stirred with its usual energy, but inside my family's homes, the rhythm had fractured. I sat at my desk in my Seattle study, sipping tea, the warmth grounding me as I observed the storm I had set into motion. At 65, patience and perspective were my allies, and now they allowed me to witness the unfolding consequences with quiet satisfaction. The first frantic call came from Leah. Her voice was sharp, trembling with a mix of fear and indignation. "Mom, the housekeepers haven't been paid. The landscaping bills are overdue. Even the cleaning service called. I can't keep track of all this." I let her words hang in the air, absorbing the panic without a word. Jason followed shortly after, his frustration boiling over. "Margaret, the credit cards are declining, vendors are calling, and the car lease. How are we supposed to manage this?" His attempts at authority were hollow against the reality I had quietly engineered. Even Peter, usually the calm one, was scrambling. Utility bills, catering deposits, and unexpected expenses cascaded through his phone calls. Each one a reminder that their comfort had always relied on invisible support. I leaned back in my chair, the afternoon sun glinting off the desk. Every halted payment, every shocked exclamation reinforced the lesson they had ignored for decades. Security without responsibility was fragile, and dependence without accountability could collapse in an instant. From my vantage point, the city moved on as usual. Unaware of the chaos playing out behind closed doors, my family, so confident in their entitlement, now struggled to navigate the very world they had assumed would always accommodate them. The weight of their reliance, their assumptions, and their untested independence pressed on them all at once, palpable even through my quiet observation. I set my tea aside and straightened in my chair. Their reckoning was far from over, and the lessons I intended to impart would stretch beyond this initial upheaval. I called a family meeting in the small conference room at my downtown office, the skyline of Seattle gleaming behind us. At 65, I had long mastered the balance between firmness and fairness, and today that skill would guide the next phase of accountability. My posture was calm hands folded on the polished table, and my eyes swept over Jason, Leah, and Peter as they took their seats, expressions weary and tense. "I've reviewed the trust distributions," I began, my voice steady. "Going forward, all allowances will be structured and monitored. Each request will require documented justification, and we will implement quarterly financial reviews. Additionally, everyone will participate in mandatory budgeting and financial counseling." Jason shifted uncomfortably, his usual bravado dampened. "Mandatory counseling?" he asked, attempting to mask frustration with a forced smile. "Yes," I replied calmly. "This is not punishment. It is preparation. Your prior reliance on unmonitored support is no longer sustainable. Independence comes with responsibility, and it is time for each of you to manage your finances with accountability." Leah exchanged a glance with Peter, both realizing the permanence of the new structure. Their murmurs of protest were polite but ineffective. The authority was absolute and deliberate. Every hesitant question, every defensive justification reinforced the lesson. I intended entitlement without effort would no longer be accommodated. I handed each of them revised allowance schedules and guides for the financial counseling sessions. The rules were firm but fair, emphasizing education, preparation, and responsibility over restriction. As they scanned the documents, the initial tension gave way to reluctant acknowledgement. They were beginning to understand that the comfort they had taken for granted came with expectations they had ignored for far too long. I collected the papers and set them aside, letting the silence fill the room. Their adjustment was only the beginning, but already the first steps toward accountability had been taken. The foundation was laid, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of control exercised wisely. I sat by the window in my Queen Anne living room, the soft Seattle rain tracing streaks across the glass, and let myself breathe. At 65, I had spent decades balancing discretion with authority, patience with resolve, and today it felt like the culmination of that careful stewardship. The city moved quietly below, unaware of the subtle revolutions that had taken place within my family. Jason had already begun adjusting to the structured allowances, meticulously reviewing his budget and attending his first counseling session. Leah was learning to prioritize, reluctantly appreciating the guidance she had long resisted. Even Peter, always the quiet observer, seemed to grasp the weight of responsibility for the first time. The chaotic panic of the past weeks had softened into steady, deliberate adaptation. I reflected on the boundaries I had set, the lessons imparted without arrogance, and the independence I had demanded not only from them but from myself as well. The family I had shaped was no longer defined solely by dependence or entitlement, but by accountability, respect, and an understanding of the value of their resources. A gentle smile spread across my face as I picked up my cup of tea. Empowerment wasn't about punishment or control. It was about clarity, guidance, and the quiet confidence that came from doing what was right, even when it was unseen. My children were learning, adapting, and most importantly, beginning to respect the framework that had supported them all along. As the rain eased and the clouds lifted, I felt a sense of calm and satisfaction settle over me. Independence boundaries and a redefined family dynamic had been achieved, and in that quiet triumph I found a deep and lasting peace